Have you ever wondered why Moses' body was never found? It's one of the greatest mysteries of the Bible, a question that has puzzled believers for centuries. Moses, one of the most influential figures in biblical history, led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, received the 10 Commandments from God himself, and performed countless miracles. And yet, despite his incredible life, his final resting place remains a mystery. Why would God hide Moses' body? What secrets surround his death, and what can we learn from them today? In this video, we're diving deep into the life of Moses, exploring the significance of his leadership, his intimate relationship with God, and the mysteries that surround his death. But before we get to the end of his story, we need to understand why Moses' life is so important, and how the events leading up to his death make the mystery of his burial all the more intriguing. Moses isn't just a name in the Bible, he's one of the Bible's greatest heroes. His journey starts with his miraculous survival as a baby in Egypt, a story that's filled with danger, hope, and divine intervention. So let's start at the beginning of Moses' extraordinary life. Moses was born into a world of turmoil. The Israelites, his people, had been living in Egypt for hundreds of years, ever since Joseph, one of Moses' ancestors, had risen to power as a governor under Pharaoh. But over time, things changed. A new Pharaoh came into power who didn't remember Joseph, and he began to see the Israelites as a threat. The Israelites had grown in number, and Pharaoh feared they might rise up against the Egyptians. To control the Israelite population, Pharaoh ordered a horrific decree. Every newborn Hebrew boy was to be killed by being thrown into the Nile River, Exodus 1:22. But Moses' mother, Jochebed, refused to let her son die. In an incredible act of faith and courage, she hid him for 3 months. When she could no longer hide him, she placed him in a basket made of papyrus and set him afloat on the Nile. This scene is one of the most touching in the Bible, showing a mother's desperate faith in God's protection. And God did protect Moses. The Bible says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." Hebrews 11:23. Moses' journey from the Nile to Pharaoh's palace was nothing short of miraculous. Pharaoh's daughter found him while she was bathing in the river. Moved with compassion, she took the child as her own, naming him Moses, which means drawn out of water, Exodus 2:10. In another twist of divine intervention, Moses' sister Miriam, who had been watching from a distance, offered to find a nurse for the child. And who did she choose? Moses' own mother, Jochebed. This allowed Moses to be raised by his biological mother in his early years, giving him a strong connection to his Israelite heritage. This beginning is crucial in understanding Moses' character and destiny. Although he was raised as an Egyptian prince, with all the luxuries and privileges that came with it, he never forgot his roots. Deep down, Moses knew he was not an Egyptian. He was one of God's chosen people, an Israelite, and this knowledge shaped the rest of his life. As Moses grew, he saw the suffering of his people. One day, while witnessing an Egyptian taskmaster brutally beating a Hebrew slave, Moses could no longer stand by. In a moment of righteous anger, he killed the Egyptian and buried the body in the sand, Exodus 2:11-12. Moses thought no one had seen the act, but the next day, when he tried to break up a fight between 2 Hebrews, one of them asked, "Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Exodus 2:14. Moses realized that his actions were known, and soon after, Pharaoh sought to kill him. Fearful for his life, Moses fled to the land of Midian, where he would spend the next 40 years of his life. During this time, Moses became a shepherd, married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, and started a family. But even in the quietness of his life as a shepherd, God was not done with Moses. One day, while tending his flock, Moses came across something extraordinary, a bush that was on fire but wasn't being consumed by the flames. Intrigued, Moses approached, and that's when God spoke to him for the first time. "Moses, Moses," God called from the burning bush, "do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Exodus 3:4-5. This encounter with God would change the course of Moses' life and the history of the Israelite people. God told Moses that he had heard the cries of the Israelites in Egypt and that he had chosen Moses to lead them out of slavery. At first, Moses was reluctant. He doubted his ability to lead such a monumental task, saying, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3:11. But God reassured him, saying, "I will be with you." Exodus 3:12. Empowered by God's promise, Moses returned to Egypt and confronted Pharaoh. However, things didn't go smoothly. Pharaoh refused to let the Israelites go, and this led to a series of plagues that would devastate Egypt. Each plague was a direct challenge to the Egyptian gods, showing that the God of Israel was the one true God. The 10 plagues were severe. The Nile River was turned to blood, frogs infested the land, lice and flies swarmed everywhere, livestock died, boils afflicted the people, hail destroyed the crops, locusts devoured what was left, darkness covered the land, and finally the most devastating plague of all, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. This final plague was especially tragic, as it included the death of Pharaoh's own son. After this, Pharaoh finally let the Israelites go, Exodus 12:31. But even after all the miracles Moses performed, Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He sent his army to chase the Israelites, and when they reached the Red Sea, it seemed like all hope was lost. But Moses, following God's command, raised his staff, and the waters of the Red Sea parted, allowing the Israelites to pass through on dry ground. When Pharaoh's army followed, the waters returned, drowning the entire army, Exodus 14:21-28. This incredible event was a powerful display of God's protection and deliverance, and it's one of the most famous miracles in the Bible. After escaping Egypt, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. During this time, God continued to provide for them, sending manna from heaven to feed them and water from rocks to quench their thirst. But despite all the miracles they had witnessed, the Israelites often grumbled and complained. Their lack of faith and disobedience frustrated Moses, but he remained a faithful leader, interceding for them before God time and again. One of the most significant moments during their time in the wilderness was when Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. The Bible tells us that the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. Exodus 24:16. On the 7th day, God called to Moses from within the cloud, and Moses entered the cloud to receive the stone tablets. These commandments were the foundation of the covenant between God and his people, a set of divine laws that would govern their relationship with him and with each other. But even while Moses was on the mountain, the people grew impatient. They made a golden calf and began to worship it, breaking the very first commandment Moses was about to deliver. "You shall have no other gods before me." Exodus 23. When Moses came down from the mountain and saw the idolatry, he was furious. In his anger, he smashed the stone tablets. Exodus 32:19. Yet even in this moment of anger, Moses did not give up on his people. He returned to God, pleaded for their forgiveness, and God, in his mercy, gave Moses a new set of tablets. Exodus 34:1. As the years passed, the Israelites continued their journey toward the Promised Land. But because of their repeated disobedience and lack of faith, none of the generation that had left Egypt, including Moses, would be allowed to enter the Promised Land. Only the new generation, those born in freedom during the 40 years of wandering, would be allowed to cross into Canaan. Near the end of his life, Moses reached Mount Nebo, and it was here that God showed him the Promised Land from a distance. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, 'I will give it to your descendants.' I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Deuteronomy 34:4. Moses had faithfully led the people for 40 years, but because of an earlier act of disobedience, striking the rock to bring forth water instead of speaking to it as God had commanded, he was not allowed to enter the Promised Land, Numbers 27:12. And so, at the age of 120, Moses died on Mount Nebo. The Bible tells us that even in his old age, his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. Deuteronomy 34:7. He was still strong, still full of life, right up until the moment God called him home. But here's where the mystery begins. Moses' body was never found. The Bible says that God himself buried Moses in a valley in the land of Moab, but no one knows the place of his burial to this day. Deuteronomy 34:6. Why would God choose to hide Moses' grave? What purpose could there be in keeping his final resting place a secret? One reason scholars believe God hid Moses' body is to prevent it from becoming a site of idolatry. Moses was such a revered figure that people might have been tempted to worship his grave rather than worshipping God. By keeping the location hidden, God ensured that Moses' legacy would remain focused on his role as a servant of God, not as an object of worship. In fact, the Bible itself warns against the worship of created things, including people and objects. In Deuteronomy 4:15-16, Moses himself warned the Israelites, "Be careful that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman." Moses' hidden grave may have been God's way of protecting the Israelites from this very temptation. Moses' life and death remain one of the most powerful stories in the Bible. His leadership, his faith, and his relationship with God set him apart as one of the greatest prophets in history. And even though he didn't enter the Promised Land himself, his legacy lived on through Joshua, who led the Israelites into Canaan after Moses' death. Today, Moses is remembered as the lawgiver, the man who spoke face to face with God, and the leader who brought the Israelites out of slavery. His story continues to inspire millions of people around the world, reminding us of the power of faith, the importance of obedience, and the enduring love of God.